but it doesn't matter. I don't usually need it. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me clearly at the back? How do I turn this on? I just need to get closer, do I? Right. I'm not used to needing a microphone. People can usually hear me, but let's see how this works. My first thing is to apologize for being dressed so formally. My problem is that I have to go on to a UN meeting in New York, where if I wasn't dressed like this, I would look out of place. So I decided it was easier to be out of place here than out of place in New York. First, just to put what I'm going to say in context, those are the aims quoted on the timetable I was sent. I hope they're the aims that you're expecting here. What I'm going to try and do this afternoon is therefore threefold. The first is to try and show how some ocean policy has developed over the last half century. The second, to try and show relationships between science and policy. And third, how some current issues in ocean policy and science are related. I better begin by introducing myself. I was born in Plymouth. You may like to see a picture of Plymouth in case you don't know it. I'll come back to that picture later this afternoon because it's a very useful demonstration of some features. I went to Oxford University. I joined a predecessor of what became the UK Department of the Environment in 1965 and worked there until 2001. I went to the Treasury Centre for Administrative Studies to do what is now the equivalent of a Master's in Public Administration. I ended up as private secretary to two UK Prime Ministers in my late 20s. I became chairman of the OSPAR Commission for the North East Atlantic, which we'll probably come back to, and then went on to be chief executive, having left the UK Civil Service. I retired in 2006, and I helped the assessment of assessments, about which Jake touched yesterday, or on Monday, and I've now been joint coordinator of the regular process, which we will come to, since 2009, and I'm expecting to go on doing that till the end of 2020. The analogy that I've chosen to use to explain the history of the whole picture of ocean policy is a river and tributaries flowing in, making it bigger and bigger. The original stream is fish and ships. We use that as the title of an OSPAR meeting in 2006 because it sounded quite good and reminded people of fish and chips. These are very ancient streams. Men and women have been fishing in the sea since at least the Mesolithic period, before 10,000 BCE. In fact, the Neolithic revolution in agriculture seemed to reduce the amount of fish they took, judging by the size of the shell middens that are found. Ships have been going on trading missions across the Indian Ocean since at least 2000 BCE, so that this is something that's been going on for a long time. The tributaries flowing into this and broadening the stream that I want to talk about are first sharing the ocean, about some of which we heard this morning. Secondly, pollution. Thirdly, biodiversity. Fourth, integration. Fifth, capacity building. Sixth, ecosystem services. And finally, the Sustainable Development Goals. My starting point is 70 years ago. Then the sea picture was quite clear. You had the territorial sea and you had the high seas. But President Truman's proclamations that we heard about this morning opened up questions. Fish had for a long time been seen as an inexhaustible supply. But it was clear that this had ceased to be so early in the 20th century because of innovations in technology, and that has got worse and worse through the 20th century, echo sounders, navigation equipment has made fishermen much more efficient. Half a century ago, there was the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, which resulted from the Titanic disaster, which you may have heard about. This is a very good example of the way in which most major policy developments are the results of a disaster. We don't seem to be able to make a major policy step until we have a disaster. There had been some efforts to control oil pollution from ships, but they hadn't been particularly successful. And on the pollution front, the ocean was seen by nearly everyone as having an open-ended capacity to assimilate whatever rubbish we put in it. And finally, the United Nations had just started. The first meeting of the General Assembly took place in Westminster in London in 1946. So, the first tributary. As we heard this morning, there was a round of UN negotiations on the law of the sea soon after the UN started. This led to 4 Geneva Conventions in 1958 on things such as the territorial sea and the high seas. But generally, people didn't like that outcome. There was a second attempt, which didn't really get anywhere. And then we had the famous intervention by the permanent representative of Malta in a General Assembly debate in which he argued for the common heritage of mankind, particularly in metallic nodules on the seabed of the high seas. That started the third UN conference on the law of the sea, which resulted in 1982 in the convention. But there were still major problems about seabed mining and fisheries. And it wasn't until we got the 1995 implementation agreements on those two subjects that most states were prepared to ratify UNCLOS, and it came into force in accordance with its arrangements. Once UNCLOS was in force, we had a much more nuanced division of the ocean. You had the internal waters and the territorial sea, where national sovereignty prevailed. You had the exclusive economic zone, where you had 4 major jurisdictions: fisheries, scientific research, offshore installations, and minerals. You had archipelagic waters, which extended some people, and you had the extended continental shelf, which meant that the broad shelf states could extend their jurisdiction over the continental shelf out to as much as 350 nautical miles, provided they showed that was geologically justifiable through the procedures of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Beyond that, you had the high seas, and beyond the extended continental shelf jurisdictions where they existed, or the exclusive economic zone where they didn't, you had the area, but this was only for minerals. And as a result of the various fisheries agreements, you had an enhanced jurisdiction for regional fisheries bodies. This left a number of gaps and frictions. One of the more significant ones was the area of the extended continental shelf jurisdiction, because that meant that you had the high seas for the water column and the coastal state for the extended continental shelf jurisdiction. And you had difficulties with that because one body was responsible for, or nobody in fact was responsible for the water column of the high seas except for regional fisheries organizations, but the coastal state had jurisdiction over the continental shelf. And you had a similar dichotomy with the International Seabed Authority for the seabed and the high seas for the water column. This was particularly problematic for issues such as biota that are benthic and sedentary for part of their life and therefore part of the seabed, and are plankton or nekton for the rest. For those who don't know the definitions, plankton are biota that just float with the current. Nekton are animals that can actually swim and have the ability to go where they want to. And likewise, there were problems in the interactions between fisheries and biodiversities on the high seas. The regional fisheries management organizations had some jurisdictions. Nobody really had any jurisdiction over general questions of high seas biodiversity. So the areas beyond national jurisdiction in the high seas became particularly significant. 60% of the surface, 90% of the biome, and though low density, a total mass is large. For example, there's a type of fish called the bristlefish, cyclothone, if you've never heard of them. They are the most numerous, probably the most numerous form of vertebrate on the planet. Estimates of their numbers put them in the tens of trillions, which is pretty large. That makes areas beyond national jurisdiction very significant for biodiversity. The cyclothone, sorry, I seem to be pressing the wrong button. The cyclothone is particularly important in the question of oxygen, of carbon capture, because every night they come up from below the photic line, 200 meters depth in most places, and start eating the plankton at the top. Next day they go back down below the photic division and stay there, so that in the whole they are part of an important biological pump, taking the carbon captured by photosynthesis in the higher layers down to the areas where it will stay down and settle down to the sediment on the seabed. We've got a lot of links between oceans and atmosphere, and that is also important for areas beyond national jurisdiction. Distribution of fish stocks and other species is changing. The sea ice habitat in polar regions is disappearing, and that's very important for the life cycle of a lot of animals. In the Antarctic polar region, you have a change between the ice algae and animals called salps. If the water is warmer, you get more salps and fewer ice algae. If you have more ice cover, you get more ice algae and fewer salps. Salps contain much less energy than ice algae. That affects the production of krill, and the production of krill is vital to the massive fishery and other animals such as whales and penguins in the Southern Ocean. And then you have the problems of not getting sufficient carbon capture and getting more acid water, which is where shellfish have problems in making their shells. So there's an important link between the areas beyond national jurisdiction and our atmospheric challenges. In the deep ocean, everything is very slow. And if they're disrupted, recovery will be slow and resilience reduced. Negotiations on the International Instrument on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction will resume in 3 weeks' time. So watch this space. It's important for us all. Now I want to go on to the second tributary into the stream of ocean policy. But before I do that, I want to make sure that you're not just sitting there dazed by this high-speed presentation. If anyone has any questions, please put up your hand and I will try and stop and answer any questions as well as I can. So, turning to the second tributary, pollution began as a problem in the second half of the 1960s. There was a famous book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. If you haven't read it, I'd strongly recommend you to look at it, because it is crucial to the whole question of human impact on the biome. We were already getting increasing control on hazardous waste disposal, particularly on land, and so there was a consequent increase in dumping hazardous waste at sea as a way of getting rid of it. As I said, people thought there was an unlimited assimilative capacity. There was growing carriage of oil by sea. You just have to think about how many more internal combustion engines were coming in the 1950s and 1960s, and how much more electricity generation from oil and gas, and the increasing amount of oil that had therefore to be carried by sea, and beaches were getting polluted by oil. Those like me who are children in the 1950s will remember that a visit to the seaside usually meant getting oil off your clothes because there was just so much oil on the beach. And there were also concerns about land-based discharges of hazardous substances and probably even more of radioactive substances. I now want to tell you the story of two ships and the 7 and more conventions and the conference that they affected. The Torrey Canyon was an oil tanker that had 120,000 tons of oil on board. It ran aground on a reef called the Seven Stones, which is in the English Channel between the Isles of Scilly and the English mainland. The Seven Stones in those days were outside English territorial waters because they're more than 3 miles from any other bit of land. This oil all spilt. Now, one of the side issues of this was that one of the prime ministers I worked for, Harold Wilson, had his holiday home on the Isles of Scilly and was much put out to have his holiday ruined by the dumping of 120,000 tons of oil on his doorstep. I was not actually involved in sorting that mess out because my predecessor, as his junior private secretary, had to handle that. But I had some of the aftermath. It was serious because it was completely uncertain what the international law was about what you could do with this. In the end, Harold Wilson tried having it bombed by the RAF to set it on fire, various interventions by the Coast Guards. It went on as a mess. One of the results was a very quick convention that said that states had the right to intervene beyond their national jurisdiction to deal with incidents that threatened the environment within their national jurisdiction. There was also a liability convention on who should be liable with provisions for compulsory insurance, and then very shortly afterwards a compensation fund convention which has been updated and so on. We then got one of the crucial ocean conventions, the Convention on Marine Pollution from Ships, which everybody calls MARPOL. It was first negotiated in 1973, but it didn't work and nobody would ratify it, so that there was a protocol in 1978 which enabled it to be brought into force, rather like UNCLOS with the implementation agreements. And then more recently we've had a preparedness convention on how states should organize themselves to deal with marine disasters. The second ship I want to tell you about is the Stella Maris. This loaded 600 tons of chlorinated waste in Amsterdam and set out to dump it in the North Sea. It was made clear to the owners of the ship by most of the North Sea states that if they dumped this stuff in the North Sea, they wouldn't be allowed back into port. And if the ship went on round the North Sea and out into the Atlantic, trying to find somewhere where it could hope to come back to if it dumped this waste. While this was going on, there was a preparatory conference for the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment, which we'll come to shortly. The Dutch delegate at that conference got up and said that if we can't deal with this sort of problem, there's no point in having the Stockholm Conference. The result of that was, for the Northeast Atlantic, the negotiation of the Oslo Convention, which dealt with dumping of waste at sea. It was negotiated and brought into force amazingly quickly. The Dutch intervention was in September 1971. The convention was signed in February 1972, and I was present at the signing of that convention. It was rather curiously signed simultaneously in Moscow, London, and Mexico City. On behalf of the UK, it was signed by my second Prime Minister, Edward Heath, who took a keen interest in it all because he was a keen yachtsman. He won the Sydney-Hobart race one year and wanted to do something about cleaning up the seas. That then led to what was originally called the London Dumping Convention, but more recently Greenpeace has pointed out that it's more the London Anti-Dumping Convention because it prevents you dumping nearly anything at sea, and so it's now usually referred to as the London Convention. And that was followed by, for the North East Atlantic, the Paris Convention on land-based sources of marine pollution, and similar regional conventions in many other parts of the world. To pick up on what has happened to MARPOL since then, the oil, it works up by the means of originally five annexes. A sixth has recently been added. These have taken their time to come into force because it required states to ratify them, and they have been updated and strengthened on various occasions. The Air Pollution Annex is the most recent. It's now been in force now for just over 10 years, and it's been strengthened already. There are concerns that it is going to make life very difficult for shipping lines because it requires them to reduce substantially their sulfur oxide and nitrogen oxide emissions, and that requires them to use much higher quality bunkers than they have been traditionally using. One of the problems about marine pollution from shipping through the air is that the ship bunkers have become more and more the residual place where you get rid of the oil that nobody else will have because it's got such a high sulfur content or is so heavy. And there are fears that the way in which that will happen in the market may make shipping more expensive with serious effects on the world's economy. We don't yet quite know what's going on that. Moving on, there are further shipping pollution issues that have been dealt with. Anti-fouling treatments, which I hope to come back to after the coffee break. Wrecks, the problem with wrecks is that they've usually got oil in them and they leak it out. Ballast water is crucial for the carriage of invasive species, and that has now come into force. And then we have the problem of shipbreaking. 70% of the world's major ships are sold to Bangladesh, India, or Pakistan for shipbreaking. And the conditions under which that shipbreaking, breaking up the ships for their metal and other components, is scandalous, in my view, both from an environmental point of view and probably even more from a social point of view because of the risks to the health and well-being of the people who are working on it. China is another big shipbreaker. Turkey is also a substantial player, but if you add those figures up, you'll see that leaves 5% of all the large ships in the world for the rest of the world to break up. So it's focused very much in those three countries. Coming back to the convention that resulted from the concerns in the late 60s, early 70s, we had the Stockholm Convention on the human environment, and I'd invite you to notice the stress on human. It had a number of important outcomes. First was setting up UNEP. Secondly was the adoption of some principles of international law. There are two that are particularly relevant here. One is that states have a duty to prevent marine pollution, some of which some states seriously don't take that seriously at all. And then Principle 21, that states have the right to exploit the resources under their jurisdiction, but that if they do so, they mustn't cause transboundary pollution, including pollution of areas beyond natural jurisdiction. The outcomes of the Stockholm Convention also included a call for what became the London Convention. It led, through UNEP, to the setting up of regional seas programs for areas where that wasn't already happening. And it also led to the setting up of a body called GISAMP, which we'll come back to later. Any more questions? Or any questions? I haven't had one yet. Let us move on to the third of my 7 tributaries to marine policy. by 1992, we had concern that we were just not managing the totality of our impact on the planet satisfactorily. We had made progress with quite a lot of sectoral things. I haven't spoken about fisheries because Jake has already covered that very well. But we had also dealt with shipping. We have dealt with some aspects of pollution. But we were not dealing with the totality of it. And so we ended up with the First Earth Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And as was remarked earlier, it was important that it was both environment and development. One of the main outputs of that was the Convention on Biological Diversity. The main follow-up on CBD has been the Aichi targets. This has commitments, a large number of commitments, I think 21 in all, but 3 of particular importance for the ocean: fish management, pollution control, and the cumulative impacts, particularly on coral reefs. Most of the Aichi targets are not going to be achieved by the dates they specify, but at least they are showing signs of movement. Now, my 4th tributary is integration, which is to some extent a reflection of the need to deal with the cumulative impact. The regional seas organisations that had been set up were looking more and more at all aspects of their areas. In 1992, the Oslo Convention on Dumping and the Paris Convention on Land-Based Pollution were revised, and we managed to find a way of making sure that the new convention for the Northeast Atlantic could cover the whole of human impact on the ocean. Similar processes were happening elsewhere. The Cartagena Convention for the wider Caribbean was developing its SPOR protocol, Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife Protocol, which was looking beyond the pollution and so on that they had been concerned with to the whole of the actions. Similar activities were taking place in the Arctic Council, in the Baltic, and elsewhere. Other countries, such as Australia, which were so big they were a region on their own, were starting to look at this and trying to make comprehensive assessments. GISAMP, which we will come back to in a moment, had recommended comprehensive assessments looking at all physical, chemical, and biological aspects. We also had, out of UNCED, Agenda 21, the agenda for the 21st century. Again, if you haven't looked at that, it's 20 years old, but it's interesting to go back and see what 20 years ago people were arguing for. You'll find that we're still arguing for a lot of that, and it hasn't been achieved. But we've still got we've still got slightly over 80 years to go for the 21st century, so there may be some hope. Chapter 17 led off with a plea for an integrated approach to managing human impacts. That is still not happening in many parts of the world. Europe has made a major progress with its Marine Strategies Framework Directive, but if you look around the world, you will find that there are still many countries which have very sectoral managements and where one silo does not talk to another silo. These sectoral approaches are a real problem. If you look at the UN level, even so, the sponsorship of GISAMP, a group of experts who are supposed to be looking at protecting the marine environment, you have to bring in an alphabet soup of 9 organizations to deal with that. And at the national level, it can be even more complex, because particularly where you have a federal state, where the federal units may be responsible for part of the ocean and the federation for other parts, and where splits between ministries can be very much more acrimonious than splits between even the UN agencies, and they're bad enough. One small focus on this came from the UK and Brazil. As a result of the 1995 Global Programme of Action on Land-Based Pollution, which was adopted in Washington, the UK and Brazil formed the view that something needed to be done at the UN level to try and break down the silo mentality. We organised 2 workshops in London to discuss this and the relationship of science to the oceans. We then had the Commission on Sustainable Development reviewing progress on the ocean. The CSD was a body set up under the Economic and Social Council of the UN to follow up on the commitments from the Earth Summit in Rio. And it looked at a different field each year. In 1999, it looked at the oceans and small island developing states. I chaired the oceans part of that review with a colleague from one of the West Indian states chairing the small island developing states part. We managed to achieve a recommendation that there should be an informal UN process able to look at any aspect of the ocean. The idea being that you needed to have somewhere that could look at across the board rather than whatever suited the individual bits of the alphabet soup. Fisheries in FAO, shipping in IMO, the meteorology in the World Meteorological Organization, atomic radioactive matters under IAEA, and so on. And in 2000, we managed to get agreement on the appallingly named UN Informal Consultative Process on Oceans and the Law of the Sea, UNICPOLOS. It's now usually called the Informal Consultative Process. It has to be reviewed every 3 years, but it's now achieved its 19th session. I was one of the co-chairs of it for the first 3 sessions. I feel very pleased that something that I helped bring into being has managed to survive 6 reviews and is now still going. This year, it looked at the subject of human-made noise in the ocean. This is something that is beginning to be seen as a real problem from many species. For a long time, it's been thought that it was a problem for cetaceans, but it's clear now that fish and possibly even other species are affected by noise in the ocean, and that ships produce much more noise than people have thought. It isn't simply seismic exploration for oil and gas. Ships' propellers waste a lot of the energy they consume in producing noise, and everyone would be better off if they could find a quieter form of ship's propeller. We are moving on now to something even more comprehensive. We had regional reviews of not merely chemistry, physics and biology, but also human impacts. And the OSPAR quality state reports, which I've given you the references for in my reading list, are examples of that, but other regions have also produced the same. Out of the discussions in the informal consultative process came the idea of regular comprehensive assessments of the state of the whole ocean. And we got the regular process out of that. Again, the UN never uses 2 words when 12 will do, and its official title is rather a mouthful. We completed World Ocean Assessment 1 in 2015. A printed version has been available since 2017. It's been available online since early 2016. You can find it in the reading list I've given, and I would like to speak in more detail about that after the coffee break. My 5th tributary is capacity building. As was pointed out before lunch, there's no point in having duties and rights to manage human activities if you don't have the capacity to do so. Just consider Kiribati, which is a small island state in an archipelago in the Western Pacific. It has a population of 120,000, but it's responsible for managing human activities in more sea than the whole of India has. 800 million people in India are responsible for less sea than the 120,000 in Kiribati. So it's not surprising that both Agenda 21 and the whole of the regular process have been trying to identify what is needed in capacity building and how you might go about it. As it has been put by many of the small island developing states, the SIDS, they should really be called big ocean states because they are responsible for a large amount of ocean. And other states need to improve their capacities, not least in their capacity to assess what's going on in the waters around them. The sixth tributary is the broadening of the idea of what we have to be concerned about. We started being concerned about humans at the Stockholm Conference. We have, in the Rio Earth Summit, we became concerned about biodiversity in general. But we are now beginning to realize that it is the way the whole ecosystem works and not the individual components that we should be concerned about. We had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's an initiative that developed largely outside the formal bodies of the United Nations, but was happily taken up by the UN system and the then Secretary General. A wide range of people were involved in producing it, and it was published in 2005. And it was really the first major global document to emphasize the idea of ecosystem services. I'm sure that you're all aware of this, the idea that there are three main types of ecosystem service: provisioning, when the ecosystem provides us with things, fish, seaweed, cooling water for power stations, whatever. The regulatory processes, which are crucially those concerned with climate, the transfer of heat from the equator towards the poles, the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the ocean takes half of it, and the cultural aspects, which we heard some about before lunch. And these feed into security, both food security and protection of coasts through mangroves, the basic materials for the good life, supporting our health, and providing the basis for good social relations. And we are more and more concerned now about trying to make sure that the ecosystem services we need for those four outputs are going to continue and the ecosystems are not going to be damaged. There were four main conclusions out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. They've changed more rapidly and more extensively than ever before. We've got a lot out of these changes. We've caught more fish. We've used the sea for transport much more. But there is growing degradation, and it calls in question whether the ecosystem services will be available for future generations. Over the next half century, unless we do something, things could get worse, and we therefore need major changes in policies, institutions, and practices. The follow-up to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment has largely been in the development of, again, a not very elegantly named, Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversities and Ecosystem Services. This has developed continental assessments, 4 of them, which are beginning to be published. Jake Rice has been co-chair of the Americas one. That's, I think, going to set quite an interesting pattern. And there is also a global assessment being produced looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services in all parts of the land mass and the oceans. I've been asked to act as a link between the regular process and the IPBES global assessment to make sure that the oceans are not overlooked, because a lot of the IPBES people are terrestrial ecologists rather than marine. And also the marine ecologists there are not always focused on things like tourism and waste disposal, which are crucial for the marine environment. They now tend to talk about nature's contributions to people rather than ecosystem services. I think they think it's easier to understand. And very importantly, their reports include possibilities for action. The seventh tributary to my stream of ocean policy are the SDGs. The crucial feature is that we now have a set of goals and targets covering everything, all aspects of the sustainable development tripod: environment, economics, social. There's a wide commitment to achieving them, but how to get there is quite uncertain. And for the ocean, the World Ocean Assessments will provide the scientific information to enable routes to the goals and targets to be discovered. We have already produced a technical abstract of the first World Ocean Assessment focused on the SDGs to show what in the 1,000 pages of the World Ocean Assessment 1 is relevant to the SDGs. It's only 25 pages long, so you don't need to think it's anything like as off-putting as World Ocean Assessment 1. But we are not producing proposals for action or even options for action. The UN General Assembly has been very clear that the regular process and its assessments should not contain policy analysis. Why you have one rule for the IPBES and another for the regular process, I don't know, but that's how it is. SDG 14 is crucial for the ocean, obviously, because it is the one focused on the ocean. It's the result of a long campaign, notably led by Prince Albert II of Monaco, who put a lot of effort into making sure that the senior UN agencies, the leaders of the UN agencies, were aware of the importance of making sure that the ocean was covered in SDG. The one thing I would criticize in it is that it talks about the oceans, and we are, in the regular process, are very clear that there is one world ocean. It may have various names for various parts of it, but it's all connected, as you will see in my presentation after coffee. The goal 14 is all-embracing. It will be very important to see what we can do about ocean warming and acidification, and each of the 10 specific targets needs to be considered separately. There are 3 numbered targets. Pollution is slightly odd in that it focuses very much on nutrient pollution rather than hazardous substance pollution, but the others are all very clear and are issues that need to be concerned. Fisheries subsidies is going to be a very difficult nettle or thistle or cactus to grasp, because it is something that divides various players in countries and is even more of a subject at international level. SIDS, as I said, are the small island developing states. LDCs are the least developed countries, and we have clearly got to find out how we can enable them to benefit more from the world ocean. The 3 lettered targets are improving marine science, and in this context, the declaration of the 2020s as the International Decade of Ocean Science by the UN General Assembly is important. Artisanal fisheries are very important because in fisheries management, focus tends to be on the commercial fisheries who have got better lobbyists, who are able to bring more pressure to bear than on the 80 million or so artisanal fisherers who can often find themselves left out of account, and where investment to provide the infrastructure to enable them to work better, such as post-harvest handling of fish, is weak. And then finally, international law. We need to get much better implementation of the whole raft of conventions that I've been talking about. Things can be done to enforce these things better. Steps are being taken in some ways, particularly through port state control, but we need to go further. I'm sorry. The SDGs are a network. There are a whole lot that will help deliver SDG 14, and delivering SDG 14 will help with another great raft. These links are spelt out in some more detail in the technical abstract to which I've referred, and I'm not going to bore you by reading out the whole list. You can always see it on this presentation. In the technical abstract, we've identified some important information and capacity building gaps that are going to have to be filled before we can achieve the SDGs. On pollution, we have inadequate management processes in many parts of the world. Even a country as wealthy and well-resourced as the United States of America is not managing to deal with quite a lot of its coastal pollution. There is in particular a large dead zone off the mouth of the Mississippi, which is becoming almost permanent. We don't know enough for marine spatial planning, and yet the conflicts between the different activities that happen in the marine space are crucial. Acidification is happening. It's going to affect very much many shellfish and shellfish fisheries. We don't know enough about how it will vary around the world. Fisheries are a problem because of lack of data for planning, but Jake has already talked about that and the progress that is being made. Conservation areas, it's all very well talking about protecting 10% of the ocean, but we don't really know what's there. Marine habitats are very poorly identified. We have explored very little of the deep ocean. We don't really know yet how to manage areas well. We need a lot of process there. Fisheries subsidies are a subset of the problems of fisheries. And then for SIDS and the least developed countries, we lack data because they haven't had the resources to collect it, and they usually lack the skilled manpower. There are things that are being done to help them. For example, the Commonwealth, what used to be called the British Commonwealth, has set up a Commonwealth Centre to support the smaller countries in the Commonwealth in this work on oceans. That is the end of my presentation for the first half of this afternoon. I hope that you have got sufficient questions to keep us going until the coffee break. Or at least I hope I haven't overrun and taken up some of the coffee break time. But please, who wants to make any comments, criticisms, or raise any questions? Over to you.
Hi, I'm Victor from Brazil. And then first, I would like to apologize because I'm going to repeat a question that I made yesterday, and especially to Jake and Cristiano. But in my opinion, I have a major concern about this ecosystem services concept regarding the utilitarian view of nature. Because I'm a biologist, I find it quite hard to see the differences between ecological functions and the benefits that we gather from it. Because in my opinion, when you analyze in a broader context, every ecological function brings some benefit for us as humans and for other species as well. So can you please comment on that a little bit?
Well, in the first place, ecosystem services are not entirely biological. One of the most important of the ecosystem services is something I want to draw attention to in my second presentation, which is the hydrothermal circulation of the ocean. the way in which the heat is shifted by the ocean currents from the equator towards the poles, the way in which that then returns at deep level in the deep ocean, is a purely physical matter and is absolutely crucial to life on this planet. So there are ecosystem services that do not involve the biome at all. They are physical. Ecosystem services are not always beneficial. Hurricanes, typhoons, and storms generally are part of the ecosystem and part of the services that the ecosystem delivers. And generally, we quite frequently pray to God to be delivered from those ecosystem services because nobody wants a hurricane on their doorstep. So you can look at the way in which things happen. There are other ecosystem services which are very difficult. Even before we had nutrient pollution of the oceans, we had problems with one particular kind of biological ecosystem service. This is the growth of certain types of algae which produce paralytic shellfish poisoning toxins in certain shellfish. You have the process whereby shellfish, like oysters and mussels, filter the water and feed on the algae. Certain types of algae will cause those shellfish to produce the toxins that will produce paralytic shellfish poisoning. That problem is becoming more frequent because of increased nutrient pollution, but it was there beforehand. And one of the crucial questions might well be, is there anything we can do where shellfish harvesting is important in order to decrease the likelihood of getting PSP toxins in shellfish? It may be a question of ensuring that the coastal currents flow better, building a breakwater, a jetty out into the sea can change the coastal currents, and it can also be a question of the way in which you get mixing of freshwater inputs. Regulating the flow of rivers may affect the way in which the algae in the ocean respond to situations. A big freshwater input can produce stratification, which in some areas is thought to increase the chances of the production of PSP toxins. And so you may actually want to intervene to reduce flows of fresh water from storms by having balancing lakes upstream so that you get a steady flow. So I think there are a whole host of ways in which you can look at ecosystem services and think how some we need to intervene to make sure we don't upset them, but there are others where we may want to intervene to see if we can prevent them or at least find ways of minimizing their impacts. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an interesting set of topics to talk about.
Okay. Was it?
Okay, thank you, Professor. I'm Kamdoum.
I'm not a professor. I'm a simple mister. I don't even have a doctorate.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm Kamdoum from Cameroon. You mentioned a set of maritime disasters that actually led to a number of conventions, among which the Liability Convention. So I don't know if you're aware of the deep water disaster.
The Deepwater Horizon disaster.
Horizon disaster,
yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if you can use this case to expand a bit on the Liability Convention in relation to the problem of flag of convenience.
Well, the Deepwater Horizon disaster was not linked to a flag of convenience, really, but you have to be very careful in your terminology. Flags of convenience are when ships are not registered anywhere and fly whatever flag they think might be convenient for the circumstances. Open registers are what people often refer to as flags of convenience. These are where ships are formally registered with a flag state, and the certain registers are very popular. Very nearly 50% of the world's major shipping fleet, that is ships over 1,000 tons, are registered in 4 jurisdictions. I'm just trying to remember them offhand. The Marshall Islands, Liberia, Panama, and I think the Bahamas, but I may be wrong on the Bahamas, but certainly the first 3. Or is it China? I think the 4th is China. Anyway, 4 states are the states of registry of about half the ships, in about half the tonnage in the world's shipping fleet of ships over 1,000 tons. Now, some of these open registers have a long history of lax regulation. Some, like Panama, seem to be trying to improve their image. Certainly the Bahamas, which is quite a big open registry, has been trying quite hard. What is happening more and more, though, is that the international community is turning towards port state control rather than flag state control. In fisheries, that has been quite important. I think one of the great achievements of the CAMLA regulatory system when they were dealing with Patagonian toothfish was getting Mauritius to start looking at what was happening to the Patagonian toothfish being landed there and how the ships were fishing. There are similar methods of port state control for oil pollution and for the social condition of seafarers. There's now an International Labour Organization convention, the Marine Labour Convention, which came into force, I think, in 2010, from memory, which tries to enforce that. And states such as Canada are already taking forceful action to make sure that when a ship comes into a Canadian port, the seafarers are being treated in accordance with the international law. This is one of the ways in which I can see that the SDG C of SDG 14 is going to be improved. I'm not sure how you make the link between the Deepwater Horizon and flags of convenience. The problem with the Deepwater Horizon, in my personal view, was that it was very much a question of regulatory capture. The Marine Minerals Organization of the United States seemed to be working rather hand in glove with some of the large oil companies and giving them an easy ride. That was my reading of the investigation that took place. That was not a flag of convenience. It was a problem that all governments have with many fields. In the United Kingdom, you'll know that the government is often referred to as Whitehall, after the name of the ancient palace where most of the government ministries are located. And there was a period when the British Ministry of Agriculture was often referred to by colleagues in other ministries as the Whitehall branch of the National Farmers Union, because they seemed to be more advocates for farmers than regulators of what farming should be doing. So there are problems here. I think the International Maritime Organization is very concerned to try and improve enforcement. I think we will see some things happening through through open registries. There is now an IMO system of auditing the management of a shipping registry to try and show how well it is doing. And I think that may make some impact. I think port state control will make some impact, but I think it's also going to be very important that all governments try to make sure that there isn't any regulatory capture at national level.
Excuse me, I'm coming back again. Actually, I was talking about the problem of the flag of convenience because I think I understood that there were about 3 countries involved in the disaster. It seems the vessel itself was registered on that Panama, and the contract was with British, and it belonged to the US. So that's why I want to understand who is actually liable. So,
well, in the first case, the British Petroleum Company, as BP as they now call themselves, they've dropped the British and the petroleum because they're now into many markets in many countries, was liable for what went wrong on the Deepwater Horizon, and they have paid out a very large sum indeed in compensation. There was no doubt that the United States was responsible for regulating the Deepwater Horizon because it was happening in United States jurisdiction. And the Marine Minerals Organization was, I think, less than effective in doing it. The Panamanian ship, well, it probably shouldn't have done what it did. It's more difficult to justify that. But as I say, my impression is that the Panamanian registry is trying to improve the quality of the ship's officers and so on in the ships under their flag.
okay, thank you.
Hello, over here. I'm Jack Daly from the U.S., but I study in Canada. Regarding the fisheries subsidies issue, you showed that an issue with that is a lack of infrastructure. I'm just looking at the World Trade Organization. There is language in there that specifies quite clearly that there cannot be fishery subsidies in either state or private or public form. And so is that lack of infrastructure, do you mean enforcement? Because all of these agreements, they have language on subsidies, and you see now developed nations in their global trade agreements they're making have language about fishery subsidies, but adding the caveat that they're allowed to have it if there's no environmental damage, which is they're just making that statement that, because then they can just say that their subsidies have no environmental damage. So just like I'd ask you to expand on the lack of infrastructure issue with fishery subsidies and why, especially developed nations and their trade agreements that they're making aren't tackling that issue.
I think the crucial distinction to make with fisheries subsidies is between beneficial fisheries subsidies and subsidies that increase fishing effort. There are a lot of subsidies around the world that increase fishing effort and therefore make it more difficult to regulate fisheries. Limits on fishing effort are a crucial part of managing any fishery. And if you have more people being encouraged to come into the activity, you're going to have more difficulty preventing overfishing. So there are a lot of subsidies of this kind that are a major problem. And they can go on having effects for a very, very long time. I think one of the most clear unfortunate fishing subsidies was in Spain. You may remember that there was a regime in Spain run by General Franco, and that parts of Spain, particularly the Basque country, were not very happy with him. He wanted to try to encourage the Basque country to like him, and the Basque country was very much focused on iron and steel production and shipbuilding. So General Franco encouraged the fishing companies in Galicia, in northwest Spain, to buy more fishing ships. And this increased the Spanish distant water fishing fleet very considerably. And we have been seeing the results of a very large Spanish distant water fishing fleet all around the world ever since. And a fleet like that having been built up and a big industry built, it is quite difficult to scale it back or bring it down. So subsidies that increase fishing effort are a problem. There are beneficial fishing subsidies because if you can improve the handling of the catch, you can reduce the amount of waste. You may be able to produce more fish meal from what you would otherwise discard. You may be able to send it to the market in better condition and thus get better prices for it. Most of the beneficial fishing subsidies are on the post-harvest end and helping, but there are also important fishing subsidies that can be beneficial, particularly in enabling artisanal fishers to fish more safely so that fewer lives are lost, and to bring their catch back in better condition so that, again, you lose less of the fish that you're taking out of the sea. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, I'm Aline. I'm from Brazil. And in Brazil, there's a lack of continuity of programs and monitoring and issues about the oceans and regulations. So I wanted to know, and if you have some comment about it, how do you see the posture of Brazilian government into these international commissions and other meetings about regulations of the oceans? If you have some comment about it, if you know something about the Brazilian posture, because, for example, the last year we had the withdrawal from the main researchers into the tuna commission, the Atlantic Tuna Commission, and now we don't have no reporting about our fishing tuna. So it's a big issue, in my point of view, for this international treatment. So what do you think about it, and if you have some comment about this Brazilian posture? Thanks.
Well, I don't know very much about Brazil, and any comments I make have to be qualified in that way. Certainly, when I was working with Brazilian colleagues in the process that led to the setting up of UNICPOLOS, I found them very well informed and well intentioned. I think there is a real problem, though, that you cannot isolate a nation's activities in relation to the ocean from its overall situation. My limited understanding is that Brazil is having a very difficult economic time. And when you're in that situation, you have to make choices of priorities. In the UK, we have been going through a period of what the government chose to call austerity, which meant that we had to give up doing a lot of things that we would otherwise like to have done, and we have had disadvantages as a result. We have a housing problem because various housing subsidies have been cut back. We have problems in potholes in the roads because expenditure on roads has been cut back. I can well understand that the Brazilian government has had to have a similar austerity program, and I don't think it's really for me to comment on whether they choose to cut back on tuna research or public health or what. It's a very difficult set of decisions to make, and you have to look at it across the board. I really don't think you can necessarily say that something ought to be safeguarded. I'm sure that all the other members of the International Commission on Tuna will regret not having that, but they may have to learn to manage without it until the Brazilian economy recovers.
No, I think he was first.
Yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. My name is Issa Elegbede from Nigeria, but based in Germany. I haven't known that in the world, the global fishery is in crisis, and especially for developing countries, aquaculture has been seen as the solution to food production, especially fish production. Now, I want to ask that, are there efforts from international organizations on trying to control and monitor the activities of aquaculture, especially mariculture? So that is my, my question.
Well, if you want to find out an international view on aquaculture, mariculture, I recommend you to have a look at chapter 13, I think it is, of the World Ocean Assessment. That's quite a good look at it. The big problem with fish production in mariculture is very largely that most of the fish that we want to eat are not herbivores. They don't eat plankton and algae. They eat other fish. So that if you want to farm them, you end up having to feed them fish meal or some other substitute. Fish meal for mariculture is in competition with the use of fish meal and fish oil for protein production on land, particularly through cattle. So you have got some complicated balances between how you can manage aquaculture, mariculture, the provision of the fish meal and fish to feed the fish, and how you can produce protein on land. The fish meal production can be enhanced through better management of the fish we catch, because you can get better production of fish meal and use more of the catch, and that's one way of helping promote this. The other is that you can try to move into farming some of the herbivore fish, or even moving into farming some of the filter feeders. Oysters, shrimp, and so on all produce protein, and you can use them as your source, and there you're going straight from primary production to protein production. The difficulty with that is that a lot of the increase in shrimp farming has been at the expense of mangroves, which has damaged both carbon capture, because the mangroves are probably the most efficient per square kilometre method of capturing carbon that we have, and also that by taking them away you weaken coastal protection and may encourage storms to damage the land. So there's an incredibly difficult set of balancing issues in managing mariculture. And you've then got other things, such as the extent to which you need to use pharmaceuticals to prevent lice in farmed fish and so on. So you can't simply say there's an easy solution to it. It's a question, region by region, area by area, of balancing all the various factors together. I'm sorry if that's not a nice black and white answer, but I don't think in that field there is one.
Hi, Rafael from Brazil. You said a little bit about sound pollution, right?
Yes.
And we know that IMO has some regulation for ballast water, biofouling. Is there any for the sounds of the ships or something like that?
Not yet,
Not yet.
but I'm sure there will be in the not too distant future. We are in the next World Ocean Assessment, we will have a chapter specifically dedicated to anthropogenic noise, and that is going to have to look both at the effects of the noise but also the reasons why it is produced. And the more that I read about it, the more I'm convinced that the design of ships' propellers is a crucial element in this. The noise that is produced by them is energy wasted from moving the ship along. And it seems to me that there ought to be a straightforward engineering solution to that. And if that can be discovered, it doesn't exist at the moment, though some engineering designs are better than others, we may actually see real progress there, because it will both reduce the damage from the noise pollution and increase the efficiency of the energy consumption by the ship, which must be a good thing.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mariana Dominguez. I'm from Venezuela. Given the political situation that we're going through in my country right now, it is very difficult to find sponsors and funding for research projects. So I was wondering if you have any recommendations on this issue on how to find funding for research.
Well, since I've never had to manage research except as a funder, I'm probably not very well placed to give you advice on how to persuade funders to produce things. I think I would, from my point of view, I used to run the UK Marine Research Programme. We there had a system of inviting researchers to come once a year so that we could tell them what policy issues we were concerned with, and they could tell us what scientific issues they were interested in researching, and we could try to make a match between them. I'm not sure that that happens on a global scale, but what you will find in World Ocean Assessment 1, and particularly in the summary, is a list of issues that we have identified as being areas where we need better knowledge. And I think you will find that funders are more prepared to be open to funding if you can show that your research is responding to a recognized international demand for better information. So I would recommend you to have a look at those bits of World Ocean Assessment 1 that are called knowledge gaps and see if you can find ways of fitting your research to support closing those knowledge gaps, because I think you will find that you then have a useful tool to persuade funding organizations, whether they're private sector, charitable, or government, that your research will have a useful input. I hope that's half an answer.
Good afternoon. My name is Shola from Nigeria. I'm concerned about a number of places in the world that we probably do not think about them, or we seems to feel maybe they're not important. A place like Somalia, and of course, of recent, Western Sahara. These are regions in the world that, of course, they're stateless, and they are key players in oceans, but they don't have government to control them. I've been accusing European Union, fishery arrangement with Morocco, and thank God, the last agreement did not cover the Western Sahara sea coast. So in your assessment, do you consider this kind of areas that seems to be full of lawlessness, and particularly Somalia has been very crucial in oceans discussion. So in your view, what do you see as possible way of maneuvering this kind of situation in the nearest future? Considering the activities of China in particular, and you mentioned Spain, they believe the whole fish in the whole world belong to them, and they're everywhere fishing. So what is your take?
Well, there are quite a lot of questions there. First, as to Somalia, in the World Ocean Assessment, we certainly looked at the problem of piracy. Piracy has been, I think it is now becoming less so, a problem in the Horn of Africa. It's also a problem particularly in the South China Sea, where if you look at the statistics, you actually find there are many more cases of piracy than around Somalia, but it's also a problem in the Caribbean, because largely connected to the drug trade, where you have got various sorts of vessels trying to get drugs across from Southern America to the United States. And it's also been a problem in Western Africa, with particularly for offshore oil and gas installations. So that there are problems all around the world. Somalia is a real problem because it's not merely a problem of piracy. There are suggestions that it is being used as a route for the illegal disposal of waste. The main evidence for that results from the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, when a large container labelled radioactive waste, or to be more precise, rifusi radioactivi, was washed up by the tsunami on the Somalian coast. That seemed to have started life in Italy as as waste from Italian nuclear power plants. There seemed to be some suggestion that a criminal organization in Italy had managed to disguise itself sufficiently as a respectable company to win a contract for disposing of radioactive waste, and that their route of getting rid of it was actually to take it to Somalia, where they had friends, and dump it. The United Nations Secretariat investigated this and came to the conclusion that the allegations could not be proven to the required level for prosecution. But the report leaves you with a very clear indication that there was something seriously wrong there. The difficulty always is that when you get organized crime involved, and this was the 'ndrangheti, which is the equivalent of the mafia in the heel of Italy, just as the mafia is in the toe of Italy and Sicily. Once you've got organized crime involved, it's getting well beyond the usual range of marine administrators, and it's very difficult. I think the only thing we can hope is that slowly the world community will manage to deal with problems such as the Western Sahara, Somalia, the Yemen, and other areas. They're not just problems from the point of view of marine administration, they're problems from the point of view of the world as a whole.
Good afternoon, I'm Oscar from Mexico. And talking about the knowledge gaps, I wonder if it is really useful, the use of data-poor methods to know the status of fish stocks, or should we still collecting more information in order to have really good information about fish stocks?
It's always better to make important decisions on the basis of good knowledge. There's no doubt about that. But decision-making under uncertainty is what government is largely about. You can always say, oh, if only I had that little bit further piece of information. You have to try to find methods that can deal with making decisions in information-poor situations. That doesn't excuse you from trying to remedy the lack of information, but you have a trade-off. You need to make them decisions. It's probably better not to just abandon fisheries regulation, but you need to try and make some decision-making. Jake Rice is one of the world's experts on how to make decisions in that field under uncertainty. Other people are equally skilled in trying to make decisions. I mean, for example, if an oil tanker runs ashore and 85,000 tons of oil are spilt into the ocean, what do you do? Do you try and put a boom round it and keep it in? But what happens if there's a storm blowing? Do you try and spray? There are a whole host of decisions that you have to make all the time without perfect information. But there are two duties. First, to make the decision to try and get the best outcome you can with the information available. And second, to improve the information so that next time it won't be so difficult.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, that may be a cop-out, but I'm afraid that's the world as I see it.
Hi, I'm Masalina Felix Mushi from Tanzania. I want just to make sure that what I'm thinking may be true. Taking an example of my beautiful country in Tanzania, when we say we have overexploitation of fish, we mean we have an exploitation of highly commercial value species. Now, I was thinking, can we use the management of highly commercial species as the strategy to manage the fishery to the tropic high developing countries? Because taking an example of Madagascar, I met one of the officials from Madagascar, and one of the things I discussed with him, he just narrated to me that they managed to do the management of the species which have high commercial value in their country, and by doing so, they have made one step ahead in managing the fishery.
I'm sorry, they have made worse?
They are doing the management of species of high commercial value in their country as one of the strategies to do the fishery management. And by doing so, they have made one step ahead by doing so. So
they have made worse, I'm sorry, it's just
they have made one step ahead by doing the management fisheries. Like they made a step
ahead.
They made a step, one step ahead. Yes, in managing the fisheries in their country. So I was thinking, if in tropical countries, speaking about the developing countries, which have high number of artisanal fishery than commercial ones, can help by taking this strategy approach.
It's an interesting balance. The one thing that the World Ocean Assessment 1 concluded was that the very large number of households relying on artisanal fisheries are poorly served by present fisheries management. Focusing purely on a commercial fishery, you can quite easily upset the balance of the fish stocks, so that you may be doing well in managing a high-value commercial species, but that may come at the expense of ensuring that there are adequate numbers of some other species, which is more important for the artisanal fishery. If you're focusing on high-value species, you also need to find ways of maximizing the value of those species, which involves having good post-harvest handling arrangements. If especially with fish, you often need to deliver it to the final consumer very quickly in order that it stays in good condition, or that it is properly frozen very quickly so that it is in good condition on arrival. I'm reluctant to get into an argument about fisheries in Tanzania and Madagascar, on which I'm not well informed, but on general principles, I think the important thing is trying to see how you can maximize the benefits for all the various levels of fishery involved. You need to make sure that the artisanal fishers, who are often dependent on it for their livelihood and their food, are able to maintain or improve their position, while at the same time trying to get as much as you can out of the commercial fishery. You have to balance it all, and I think focusing on one element to the exclusion of others would not be a good long-term strategy.
Now the problem comes, there have been so many projects that have been conducted in Tanzania, like raising the income of the artisanal fishers and so forth. But what happened, few years back we had prawns fishery closure in Tanzania. But the closure was just for the commercial fishers. So the artisanal fishers were allowed to fish. What happened after the opening of the prawns fishery? The stock had reduced to the suppressed state. Like maybe the commercial fishery was just going on, or nothing else was done. But what revealed from the situation is that closing the commercial fishery did not help to raise the stock of prawns in Tanzania, because it just increased the pressure to artisanal fishers towards the prawns fishery. Why? Because the commercial companies of prawns, they all requested the artisanal fishers to go and collect the prawns and bring to them. So nothing was done on that. And this is only because of the financial and human capacity of Tanzania. I may also say that. So.
Well, I can understand entirely. That's straightforward economics is what you're talking about. You probably, if you wanted to close the fishery to the commercial people, you had to restrict the amount that they could buy as well as what they could catch. It seems to me to fit in with what I was saying, that it was a partial examination of what was likely to happen. Closing a fishery for some fishermen will probably encourage them to acquire the fish by another route.
So, hey guys, we have just one more question until our break, so try to be patient. And I ask you for have your question and answer, try to be quick. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Krishna. I am from Mauritius, and maybe many of you do not know where Mauritius is, because many of you have been misunderstood and taking it to be Mauritania, but it's not Mauritania. Mauritania is some other country in main block Africa. Mauritius is a small island in the Southwest Indian Ocean. I have a very simple question. It's concerning ballast water. So I'd just like to know if there is any convention or protocol which regulates the disposal of ballast water in territorial waters of other countries.
The simple answer is that there is the International Convention on the Management of Ballast Water, which is one of the IMO conventions, and you can read about it on the International Maritime Organization's website. It's a very new one. It's only just coming into force. Basically, the idea is that ships in ballast should exchange their water well away from coastal waters. If you set off from Port Elizabeth in South Africa to go to Mauritius, when you're well outside the coastal waters, you should get rid of your ballast water that you took on in Port Elizabeth and take on some water from the high seas, which is not likely to carry invasive species into Mauritius or anywhere else. Obviously, there are problems with that because you can only really make a ballast water exchange in relatively calm conditions. But on long voyages, you ought to be able to do that. The view that this is based on is that coastal species may well become invasive in other coastal areas, but they're not likely to become a problem on the high seas. And likewise, species taken in with ballast water on the high seas are not likely to cause a problem in coastal waters because the conditions will just not support them. So there is a new convention on this. It is being implemented, and it's beginning, I think, to show that this method of working is feasible. It can be done, but the question is really whether it will produce a reduction in the number of invasive species that are being transported in ballast water, and that will take 10, 20 years to know whether it is making a difference. Theoretically, it clearly should. The question will be the extent to which ships actually comply with the Ballast Water Convention. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.